Welcome back to a new deep dive.
Oh, yeah.
Today we're going deep into the world of political philosophy
Okay.
with John Rawls, A Theory of Justice.
All right.
We've got a stack of sources here, excerpts from the book, some critical essays, even some real-world examples to see how his ideas play out.
Rawls is fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because he doesn't just tell us what justice is. He tries to build a framework for how we'd actually choose principles of justice as if we were designing a society from scratch.
All right, so our mission in this deep dive is to understand Rawls' core arguments for his idea of justice as fairness.
Okay.
We'll definitely be encountering concepts like the veil of ignorance in the original position. But what I'm really curious about is how these abstract ideas translate into the real world.
That's the key question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Rawls starts by highlighting how deeply the structure of society impacts individual lives, our political systems, economic arrangements, even social norms. They all shape our opportunities and choices from the very beginning.
So if we're aiming for a just society, where do we even begin?
Right.
It's not like we can just hit a reset button.
Rawls proposes a thought experiment.
Okay.
That original position you mentioned.
Right.
Imagine individuals coming together to agree on principles of justice. But, and here's the crucial part, they do so behind a veil of ignorance.
Okay, so no one knows their social status, their talents, their advantages, or even their own personal values.
Exactly.
It's like a giant social reset.
Yeah.
Forcing everyone to think impartially.
Exactly. Rawls argues that from this perspective, we choose principles that ensure a fair system for everyone.
Okay.
Regardless of where we end up in that society, because behind that veil, any one of us could be the most vulnerable, the least advantaged.
This seems like a radical departure from, say, utilitarianism.
It is.
Where the focus is on maximizing overall happiness, even if it means some individuals lose out.
Rawls argues that utilitarianism, while well-intentioned, could lead to outcomes that are deeply unfair to certain individuals or groups.
Okay.
He believes that in the original position, we would reject such a system.
Because we wouldn't want to risk being on the losing end of that equation.
Right. Right.
It makes sense from a self-preservation standpoint, even if we're stripped of all our specific knowledge.
Precisely.
Right.
And that's why Rawls believes we'd land on two fundamental principles. The first guarantees equal basic liberties for all. Things like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and the right to vote. It's about protecting those fundamental freedoms that allow us to live as autonomous individuals.
So even in this hypothetical scenario, we're already prioritizing individual liberty as a cornerstone of justice.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
It is, but it's the second principle where things get really complex.
Okay.
This principle focuses on social and economic inequalities, and it has two parts.
Okay.
First, any inequalities must benefit everyone, particularly the least advantaged. Second, opportunities must be open to all, meaning no one is unfairly excluded from positions of power or influence.
Okay, so it's not about eliminating inequality altogether.
Right.
It's about structuring those inequalities in a way that ultimately uplifts everyone, especially those at the bottom.
Exactly. And this leads to Rawls's famous difference principle,
Okay.
which prioritizes the well-being of the least advantaged.
Yeah.
It's like saying, we can have differences in wealth and income, but only if those differences make life better for the people who need it most.
This raises a big question for me.
Yeah.
Why would people in the original position actually choose these principles?
Right.
Especially the difference principle. What's the logic there?
One key argument Rawls makes is about the strains of commitment.
Okay.
Imagine a society that doesn't uphold these principles.
Right.
Basic liberties are violated, inequalities are deeply unfair, and opportunities are rigged in favor of a select few in such a society.
Yeah.
Resentment, alienation, and even rebellion are almost inevitable.
So it creates instability.
Yes.
Which ultimately undermines the very system of cooperation that a society needs to function.
Exactly. Rawls believes that the two principles, by fostering a sense of fairness and mutual respect, minimize these strains of commitment.
Okay.
Even if we don't always get the exact outcome we desire, we can trust that the system itself is just and that our basic rights are protected.
It's like choosing a system where we might not always win, but we also know we won't be completely trampled on.
Right.
It's about creating a system that feels stable and predictable, even with its inherent inequalities.
And that leads to another crucial point. The sense of fairness for Rawls isn't just about practical benefits or self-interest. It's also about our moral development as individuals.
You mean that living in a just society actually shapes how we think about right and wrong?
That's exactly what Rawls argues. He connects our sense of justice to moral feelings like guilt and shame, suggesting that these emotions arise when we violate principles we recognize as fair. He even talks about a concept called excusable envy.
Excusable envy. Now, that's a phrase I haven't heard before.
Yeah.
What does he mean by that?
It's envy that arises when social disparities are so vast that they undermine our self-respect, making us feel like we're worth less than others. It's a natural human response to a system that feels deeply unfair.
So while Rawls doesn't advocate for complete equality of outcome, he recognizes that extreme inequalities can have a corrosive effect on individuals and on society as a whole.
Yes. And for him, a just society would strive to minimize those kinds of disparities, not just through legal protections, but through institutions that promote genuine equality of opportunity and a basic level of well-being for all.
This is all so much more nuanced than I initially realized.
Yeah.
It's not just about abstract principles. It's about the very fabric of society and how it shapes our lives, our choices, even our sense of self.
It is, and we've only just begun to unpack the implications of Rawls' theory. There's so much more to explore, especially when it comes to how these principles translate into actual institutions and policies.
Before we go there, I want to pause for a moment and let all of this sink in.
Okay.
Because this isn't just philosophy. It's a roadmap for building a more just world.
It is. And it all starts with that thought experiment, that challenge to imagine ourselves behind the veil of ignorance.
Right.
If you were in that position, what principles would you choose? What kind of world would you want to create knowing you could end up anywhere in it?
That's a powerful question to consider.
It is.
And it's one we'll continue to explore as we dive deeper into Rawls' theory of justice. We'll be right back with a look at how his principles translate into the design of real-world institutions, from constitutions to legal systems to economic arrangements.
Yep.
Stick with us.
All right.
All right, we've laid the groundwork with Rawls' idea of justice as fairness, and those two fundamental principles he says we'd choose in the original position.
Yeah.
But how do we actually go from these abstract ideas to a functioning society?
That's where things get really interesting. Rawls doesn't just leave us with lofty principles. He provides a framework for how they could shape real-world institutions.
So we're talking about constitutions, legal systems, economic policies.
Exactly.
The nuts and bolts of how a society actually operates.
Exactly. Rawls outlines a 4-stage sequence for applying the principles of justice to institutions. It helps us see how those initial choices behind the veil of ignorance would cascade outward.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are those 4 stages?
The first stage, as we've discussed, is choosing those basic principles of justice themselves, that original position behind the veil of ignorance.
Right.
That sets the foundation for everything that follows.
It's like establishing the core values of a society, the non-negotiables.
Precisely. Then, in the second stage, we move to choosing a constitution that embodies those principles. Here, the veil of ignorance is partially lifted.
Okay.
Those designing the Constitution know more about their society, but they still don't know their individual positions within it.
So they're crafting a system that's fair for everyone, even though they're still in the dark about their own personal stake in it.
Exactly.
It's like a safeguard against self-interest creeping in.
Exactly. It ensures that the system isn't rigged to favor any particular group or individual. Then comes the third stage, which focuses on legislation.
Okay.
Here, lawmakers have even more knowledge about their society's specific needs and circumstances, but they're still bound by those principles of justice and the Constitution chosen in the previous stages.
So the laws they create have to be consistent with that initial commitment to fairness.
Exactly.
Even as they grapple with complex real-world issues, it's a fascinating balance of idealism and pragmatism.
It is. And finally, in the fourth stage, we get to the application of rules in specific cases. This is where judges, administrators, and individuals make decisions based on the laws and institutions that are already in place.
So this is where the rubber really hits the road, right?
Precisely.
Where those grand principles of justice have to be translated into daily life.
Precisely. And throughout all 4 stages, Rawls emphasizes the importance of what he calls publicity.
Publicity.
So we're talking about making sure everyone knows about these principles of justice, like a marketing campaign for fairness.
Not quite a marketing campaign, but the idea is that the rules and principles governing society should be open and accessible to everyone.
Okay.
People need to understand the reasons behind the laws, the institutions, the decisions being made.
So transparency and accountability are key for building a just society. It's not enough to have fair principles if they're hidden away in some dusty law book that no one understands.
Exactly. People need to be able to see how those principles are being upheld or violated.
Right.
And they need to have the power to hold those in power accountable.
Okay, so we have this four-stage sequence, but what about specific rights and liberties?
Right.
How do those fit into Rawls' vision?
Well, one area he dives into, and which is particularly relevant today, is the principle of equal liberty of conscience.
Freedom of thought, belief, religion.
Yes. These are hot-button issues in any society.
Yeah.
And lines can get blurry really fast.
They can. And Rawls argues that these liberties should be protected for everyone, even those who hold beliefs that we might find deeply objectionable.
Wait, even the people we vehemently disagree with?
Yes.
Why would we agree to that, especially in that original position behind the veil of ignorance?
Because behind that veil, we don't know what beliefs we'll end up holding.
I see.
We could be the ones who need that protection.
Right.
It's a powerful argument for toleration, not on the grounds of expediency or social harmony, but on the very grounds of justice itself.
So it's not about being nice or avoiding conflict. It's about recognizing the inherent right of every individual to think for themselves, even if their conclusions lead them to places we find abhorrent.
It's a challenging principle, no doubt.
Yeah.
But one that Rawls believes is fundamental to a just society. And this extends to political justice and equal political rights as well. He's a strong advocate for democratic institutions where all citizens have an equal right to participate in the political process, to vote, to hold office, to influence the laws that govern them.
It's about making sure those basic liberties aren't just theoretical. They have to be enacted in a way that gives everyone a voice.
Precisely. He emphasizes the need to ensure the fair value of these political liberties, meaning that just having the right to vote isn't enough.
Okay.
Citizens need access to information, education, and the resources that allow them to participate meaningfully. They need to be able to understand the issues, weigh the arguments, and make informed choices.
So it's not just about ticking a box on a ballot. It's about creating a system where everyone has a genuine chance to make their voice heard and to shape the direction of their society.
It's about active and engaged citizenship, informed by those principles of justice we talked about.
This is all starting to paint a much clearer picture of how those initial principles chosen behind the veil of ignorance would actually manifest in a functioning society.
And we haven't even touched on Rawls' ideas about economic systems and the role of government in ensuring a just distribution of resources.
Right, because even with those foundational principles and a fair political system, economic inequality can undermine everything we've been talking about.
Exactly. And that's where Rawls's ideas about pure procedural justice come into play. He argues that in some cases, if the procedures are fair, then the outcome is considered just, even if it leads to certain inequalities.
So it's not about guaranteeing everyone ends up with the exact same amount of wealth or resources.
Right.
It's about making sure the game itself is played fairly.
It is. And Rawls believes that under ideal conditions, a perfectly competitive market could be an example of pure procedural justice.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
A free market where individuals are essentially competing with each other. How does that square with his emphasis on fairness and the well-being of the least advantaged?
That's a question worth exploring. And we'll do just that when we continue our deep dive into Rawls' A Theory of Justice in our next segment.
We left off talking about Rawls and this idea of pure procedural justice.
Right.
How a fair process can lead to a just outcome, even if it results in some inequality.
Yeah.
But we ended on a bit of a cliffhanger. How does he reconcile this with the idea of a free market, where competition by its very nature creates winners and losers?
It's a crucial question, and one that gets to the heart of Rawls' thinking about economic justice. He's not naive about the potential pitfalls of free markets.
Right.
He recognizes that they often lead to disparities in wealth and power.
So it's not about blindly embracing laissez-faire capitalism.
Not at all. Remember, for Rawls, those two principles of justice are non-negotiable, regardless of the economic system a society chooses. Any system that undermines equal basic liberties or fails to benefit the least advantaged would be considered unjust.
So where do free markets fit into this framework?
Rawls argues that a perfectly competitive market under ideal conditions could theoretically be seen as a form of pure procedural justice.
I am still having trouble wrapping my head around that. Help me connect the dots.
Think about it this way. In a truly free and fair market, prices are determined by supply and demand. No single entity, no corporation or individual has the power to manipulate the market for their own benefit. Everyone is playing by the same rules.
So it's like a level playing field where success is determined by merit and effort, not by privilege or unfair advantage?
That's the idea, at least in theory.
Right.
Now, Rawls is very clear that this is a hypothetical scenario.
Okay.
Real-world markets are never perfectly competitive or perfectly fair.
Right.
We have monopolies, information asymmetry, all sorts of things that distort the market and create opportunities for exploitation.
Right, and we see those distortions playing out all the time with massive corporations wielding outsized power.
Yeah.
And wealth concentrated in the hands of a few.
Yeah.
It doesn't exactly scream justice.
It doesn't. And that's where the role of government becomes crucial in Rawls' framework.
Okay.
He argues that it's the government's responsibility to regulate markets, correct for those failures, and ensure that the basic needs of all citizens are met.
So it's not a hands-off approach. The government has a role to play in creating a just economic system,
Absolutely.
even one based on a market framework.
Absolutely. Rawls envisions what he calls a distribution branch of government,
Okay.
responsible for things like taxation, social welfare programs, and public education.
Using those tools to redistribute wealth, ensure genuine equality of opportunity,
Exactly.
and basically create a safety net for those who might stumble in a competitive economy.
Exactly. He even argues for something like a guaranteed minimum income
Okay.
to ensure everyone has a basic level of economic security.
Which is an idea that's gaining traction today,
It is.
especially with concerns about automation and rising inequality.
It is, and it reflects Rawls' deep concern for the least advantaged. He's not just interested in abstract principles. He's concerned with how those principles translate into the lived experiences of people, especially those who are most vulnerable.
That's what makes his theory so compelling, I think.
Yeah.
It bridges the gap between lofty ideals and practical realities.
It does. And while Rawls is often categorized as a liberal thinker, his ideas are far more nuanced than those labels suggest.
That's been clear throughout this deep dive.
Yeah.
His emphasis on individual liberty resonates with libertarian ideas.
Right.
His concern for the poor and marginalized aligns with socialist values. And his focus on fair procedures and the rule of law is something that ideally everyone should be able to get behind.
His work offers a framework for thinking about justice that transcends traditional ideological divides, which is probably why it remains so relevant decades after it was first published.
It's definitely challenged my own assumptions about what a just society would look like.
As we wrap up, I think it's fitting to leave our listeners with one of my favorite quotes from Rawls. Justice is the first virtue of social institutions, as truth is of systems of thought.
Powerful words. It's a reminder that justice isn't just a nice ideal, it's the very foundation of a good society. And the pursuit of justice, as Rawls shows us, is a complex, challenging, but ultimately necessary endeavor.
It is, and it's a conversation that we all have a responsibility to participate in. So, to our listeners, keep thinking deeply, keep questioning the world around you, and keep pushing for a more just and equitable future.
That's what these deep dives are all about. Until next time.